with Amelia Martinez and waited until the others left before asking, "Miss, please forgive me if I'm being too nosy, but it feels like you have some issues with Sister Ava Wilson and her people." Amelia Martinez remembered that Emily Johnson had been bedridden for a while and didn't know much about the interactions between them. Now she was picking up on it, so Amelia Martinez simply explained, "There's nothing like that. You should go and finish packing." Seeing this, Emily Johnson couldn't press further. Though she still felt some doubt, she muttered a few words to herself before leaving. Early the next morning, Amelia Martinez was already up and fully prepared, and Emily Johnson was already waiting outside the door. As she checked her things one last time, Charles Blackwood arrived, took their bags, and said with a smile, "It's not as if you're leaving for good. No need to bring your entire belongings along." Amelia Martinez smiled and murmured in a barely audible voice, "Who can say for sure?" Her voice was soft, but Charles Blackwood heard it clearly. His smile showed a slight hint of concern, but he said nothing further and led the way out. Amelia Martinez felt pleased, knowing she would finally get to go out and see the world. Emily Johnson was even more excited, chattering nonstop. Growing up in Northern Tan Kingdom, she was incredibly curious about the outside world. She'd heard of countries with different clothes, different languages, and even different writing, like the strange characters misused. Now that she could actually go out, she was thrilled beyond words. Before leaving, Amelia Martinez glanced over at James Smith and Ava Wilson sitting on their horses. Ava Wilson was looking in her direction, making Amelia Martinez quickly avert her gaze, pretending not to notice. But she thought, since they'd be traveling together, she ought to at least exchange a smile. She turned back, only to see Ava Wilson had already looked away, leaving her smile hanging awkwardly, and she couldn't help but close her lips slowly. Emily Johnson, already seated in the carriage, saw Amelia Martinez lingering outside and leaned out to ask, "Miss, is something wrong?" Amelia Martinez quickly shook her head and entered the carriage, only to realize there was another person inside. It was Charles Blackwood. "Why are you in this carriage too?" Amelia Martinez asked, surprised. "I don't feel at ease with just the two of you alone in here, and besides," Charles Blackwood suddenly leaned closer to Amelia Martinez and whispered, "I'm not willing to part from you." His words made Amelia Martinez blush deeply. She snuck a glance at Emily Johnson, who was covering her mouth, stifling a laugh. Amelia Martinez cleared her throat. Understanding her meaning, Emily Johnson turned to gaze out the window, pretending not to have seen or heard anything, then commented, "We're already on our way." Seeing this, Amelia Martinez could only glare at Charles Blackwood a few times. He merely looked back at her with innocent eyes, as if he hadn't done anything. Then he moved over and sat right next to her. Emily Johnson's face seemed even redder than Amelia Martinez's. Thinking about how long the journey would be, and how much longer she'd have to endure as a third wheel, she decided that the trip might end up feeling endless. Fortunately, after receiving Amelia Martinez's warning, Charles Blackwood refrained from any further flirtations, behaving decently for the rest of the way. Before long, Emily Johnson grew restless. The scenery outside was monotonous and, after a while, she lost interest. With nothing else to do, she quickly pulled out the deck of cards she had prepared especially for the trip. Amelia Martinez was a bit surprised that Emily Johnson had brought a deck of cards along. Seizing the opportunity, she teased her, "Back in my homeland, this would definitely count as an addiction. You'd probably be thrown in jail, or rather, the authorities would get involved." Emily Johnson, sidestepping the main point, asked, "What's jail?" Amelia Martinez felt herself break into a bit of a sweat. She'd been speaking in those terms for more than 20 years, so changing her wording on the spot was challenging. Emily Johnson often seized opportunities to ask strange questions, and some phrases simply defied easy explanations. Fortunately, this time it was just, "jail." Amelia Martinez put on a wise tone and said, "It's just a word from my homeland, something like your local authorities here." Emily Johnson nodded in understanding. Charles Blackwood seemed intrigued and commented, "So many interesting things from Amelia's homeland." Amelia Martinez gave Charles Blackwood a pointed look. Sensing her reaction, he wisely dropped the subject. Even Amelia Martinez felt that Charles Blackwood was acting rather uncharacteristically today, being almost too nice to her. It felt odd, as though he were trying to keep her from changing her mind about the trip. She reasoned he was probably acting nicer now to make her feel secure. Once they traveled far enough that she couldn't turn back, he would surely reveal his true colors. Yes, it must be that, Amelia Martinez thought to herself. If Charles Blackwood had known he was being so slandered in her thoughts, he might have felt like crying. He was simply trying to be a little kinder. Was it really so hard? How do you play this? Charles Blackwood's interest shifted to the deck of cards, and he asked curiously. Amelia Martinez couldn't be bothered to explain, watching as Emily Johnson enthusiastically began describing everything. When she pulled out 2 special cards, Emily Johnson introduced them solemnly. "Miss says this is a turtle, and in her homeland, it's considered the big boss, a creature with incredible longevity." The big boss? Charles Blackwood stumbled over the words, his face darkened with a few awkward lines. He glanced over at Amelia Martinez, who wore an expression of indifference as if she hadn't heard a thing. Charles Blackwood grew even more certain that there was some hidden meaning here. The term turtle made him think of less than noble associations, and as for its supposed long life, he'd rather disregard that part. Amelia Martinez felt mortified, unsure of what Charles Blackwood might be thinking. He was probably beginning to question the authenticity of this tale. She decided to play dumb and pretend as if she hadn't noticed anything unusual. Without the hidden thoughts the two shared, Emily Johnson looked at the silent pair and quickly urged, "Your Highness, Miss, why don't we play around?" After half a day's journey, Emily Johnson had lost some of her fear of the prince, especially seeing how informally he spoke with her Mississippi. He didn't seem all that imposing anymore, and she certainly wasn't scared. Charles Blackwood showed great interest, nodding his head, and then inviting Amelia Martinez to join as well. Amelia Martinez had been feeling a bit restless too. Worried that Emily Johnson would turn the teasing on her if she refused, she made a few polite excuses and then, feigning reluctance, agreed with a quick, "Fine, I'll play." Emily Johnson excitedly began shuffling the cards. Charles Blackwood initially didn't know how to hold his cards, but after observing Amelia Martinez, he started to imitate her moves quite well. Each time, Amelia Martinez ended up being the landlord and effortlessly won each round, leaving the others thoroughly defeated. Charles Blackwood, being new to the game, didn't fully understand the rules. When it was his turn to be the landlord, he hurriedly gathered his cards. In the end, Charles Blackwood naturally lost miserably, and Amelia Martinez gave him a good-natured tap on the head. Emily Johnson, on the other hand, didn't quite have the courage to tap the Crown Prince on the head, though Charles Blackwood laughed heartily and said, "Go ahead, don't be shy. Give it a tap." Amelia Martinez joined in, encouraging Emily Johnson by saying, "Emily Johnson, go on, give him a good smack. Don't be afraid." Finally, seeing that Emily Johnson still lacked the courage, Amelia Martinez took advantage of Charles Blackwood's momentary distraction to give him a playful tap on the head on Emily Johnson's behalf. Seeing Charles Blackwood looking frustrated, Emily Johnson couldn't help but offer him a bit of advice. "Your Highness, let's avoid being the landlord. We can team up instead, and maybe we'll stand a better chance of winning. Otherwise, we're just setting ourselves up to lose." "Oh, really?" Charles Blackwood looked pitifully at Amelia Martinez, who was reclining with a serene expression, enjoying her role as the landlord. Amused but still following Emily Johnson's suggestion, he began passing up the opportunity to be the landlord and let Amelia Martinez take the role every round. Eventually, he and Emily Johnson refused to flip the cards, automatically making Amelia Martinez the landlord each time. Although Charles Blackwood and Emily Johnson managed to win a few rounds by sheer luck, they grew increasingly disheartened, their faces turning gloomy with each loss. Amelia Martinez may have seemed small and frail, but when she played, she was ruthless. After several more rounds, both Charles Blackwood and Emily Johnson finally gave up. Emily Johnson secretly thought she would have to practice by herself and come back more prepared next time. She couldn't keep losing like this. Amelia Martinez didn't mind and leaned back, calmly sipping her tea and nibbling on sunflower seeds. Charles Blackwood, however, seemed far from tired of losing and went over to play against Emily Johnson alone. Emily Johnson was delighted, as she had more experience than he did and had the upper hand, glad to have someone to practice with. At first, things went just as Emily Johnson wanted, and she won nearly every round. Though she dared not gloat openly over a prince, she was thrilled with her winning streak. But after 10 rounds or so, Charles Blackwood seemed to grasp the pattern of the game and won several consecutive rounds. Emily Johnson, feeling defeated, started to get frustrated and, in a half-joking manner, declared she was done playing and would go find Miss to play instead. Seeing this, Charles Blackwood didn't press her to continue but instead went over to Amelia Martinez, who was still lounging and enjoying her tea. She gave him a slight eye roll. Just then, the carriage suddenly stopped. Emily Johnson, curious, was about to look outside and Ronald Blackwood's voice came from outside. "Brother, let's settle here for the night and continue our journey in the morning." Amelia Martinez realized that the sun had already set and the landscape outside was unfamiliar. When she got off the carriage, she found the surroundings vastly different from Northern Tan Kingdom. Compared to this place, Northern Tan Kingdom seemed like a paradise. All around, there was nothing but rolling yellow sand, and despite the darkness, she could still feel the desert's harshness as grains of sand blew into her eyes. "Let's all head inside," Charles Blackwood called out, noticing the change in the weather. He reached out to hold Amelia Martinez's hand, steadying her, and she felt a weight settle in her chest. Together, they followed the flickering lights toward a nearby inn. The inn was small, with a modest setup. There were only a few people inside, and a young man dressed as a server lay asleep on a table. Charles Blackwood knocked on the door and then entered, choosing a spot for them to sit. The young attendant, who had been dozing off, quickly rubbed his sleepy eyes and asked, "What can I do for you, patrons? A meal or a room? First, prepare some food, and then arrange a few of your finest rooms," Charles Blackwood replied, glancing around the room. Right away, the young attendant responded with newfound energy. At that moment, a middle-aged man approached, likely the innkeeper. The innkeeper, seeing the group's demeanor, recognized them as distinguished guests and personally poured tea to welcome them. "What would you like to eat, patrons?" Just then, Ava Wilson entered as well. Amelia Martinez, recalling the earlier events from their departure, called out instinctively, "Sister Ava Wilson, come sit with us." Ava Wilson hesitated, surprised that Amelia Martinez was addressing her. After a brief moment of surprise, she quickly regained her usual composure and smiled, saying, "There's no need to trouble yourself, sister. It's spacious here, no need for us to crowd. I'll take the table nearby." Amelia Martinez didn't insist. At that moment, James Smith also came in and, having heard Ava Wilson's words, quickly added, "Yes, yes, don't worry, little sister. We'll sit nearby." Amelia Martinez could only nod. Emily Johnson, though sensing something unusual between them, felt it inappropriate to pry. Reflecting on how Brother James Smith had been taking care of her these past few days, she felt a pang of sadness not being able to sit and chat with him. She resolved to find an opportunity to express her thanks properly but, worried that her lady might misunderstand, she chose to play it safe, sipping her tea silently. "We've now left Northern Tan Kingdom's borders. Another day or two, and we'll be in Ujungwa Kingdom," Ronald Blackwood remarked, glancing around the securely shut room. "Yes," Charles Blackwood replied, sipping his tea with a confident air. It's been a peaceful half-day, but let's not drop our guard tonight. We'll need to remain vigilant. While discussing matters, the two brothers, Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood, didn't exclude Amelia Martinez and Emily Johnson. Though she listened, Amelia Martinez felt a heaviness in her chest. She knew that their concerns about safety and danger likely pointed to Henry Blackwood and his followers. If Ronald Blackwood secured an alliance through marriage with Ujungwa Kingdom, it would diminish Henry Blackwood's chances further. Undoubtedly, Henry Blackwood would not stand idly by, and with Ava Wilson and James Smith traveling with them, who knew what they might attempt. I wonder if this plan will succeed, Charles Blackwood sighed, casting a sympathetic glance at Ronald Blackwood, who was quiet as usual, and feeling a pang of guilt for the burden he had placed on him. Marriage alliances have been customary for generations. I doubt they'll refuse, Ronald Blackwood replied, finishing his tea in one swift gulp. Amelia Martinez had little prior interaction with Ronald Blackwood, so she wasn't familiar with his expressionless demeanor. However, she could sense a shadow of melancholy beneath his stoic face. It seemed that for Charles Blackwood to ascend the throne safely, Ronald Blackwood considered even the greatest sacrifices necessary. For reasons unknown, Amelia Martinez suddenly felt a strong aversion to the throne itself. So many people were willing to sacrifice anything to claim this seat of power. Was it truly for the people or merely for personal ambition? Henry Blackwood had done so, making her wait a lifetime. And now Charles Blackwood was doing the same, sacrificing his brother's happiness for it. And beyond that, she wondered if his feelings for her were real or simply another step in his scheme for power. As Amelia Martinez thought about this, her brows unconsciously furrowed, and her hands twisted together tightly. Charles Blackwood, noticing her discomfort, asked, "What's wrong, Amelia? Are you not feeling well in this climate?" Amelia Martinez could only nod and, pulling Emily Johnson along, said, "I'll go rest first. You all should get some sleep early as well." Ronald Blackwood remained expressionless, sipping his tea quietly. Charles Blackwood quickly stood up and called the innkeeper over. "Take the young lady to a room, and prepare a meal to be sent up later." Amelia Martinez tried to decline the food, but seeing that she couldn't dissuade Charles Blackwood, she reluctantly agreed. Emily Johnson, thinking Amelia Martinez was truly unwell, helped her up the stairs, a worried look on her face. Before going up, Amelia Martinez glanced over at Ava Wilson and James Smith, who happened to be looking her way as well. She felt a bit awkward, but Ava Wilson nodded at her in a seemingly casual manner, while James Smith appeared to exchange a glance with Emily Johnson, causing her to quickly lower her gaze. James Smith then looked at Amelia Martinez, as if acknowledging her with a slight nod. Amelia Martinez pretended not to notice Emily Johnson's flustered look and kept her head down, quietly following the innkeeper. "Young lady, this is the best room I have here. If you wake early, you can even catch a glimpse of the sunrise over the desert, a sight quite different from that in northern Tan Kingdom," the innkeeper said enthusiastically as he led Amelia Martinez into a room lavishly praising the view of the sunrise. The idea of seeing the sunrise intrigued her. "What's wrong, miss? Where are you feeling unwell?" Emily Johnson asked with concern, helping Amelia Martinez sit down and pouring her a cup of tea. Amelia Martinez shook her head, smiling. "It's nothing, the air outside was just a bit stuffy. I wanted to come up here and rest properly." Emily Johnson finally relaxed and said, "Ah, so that's it." Amelia Martinez nodded, feeling the fatigue from the bumpy journey, though she forced herself to stay alert. "Emily Johnson, come here. I have something to discuss with you." Upon hearing this, Emily Johnson quickly put down her tasks and sat across from Amelia Martinez, asking, "Whatever you need, miss, just say it. How are things between you and brother James Smith?" Amelia Martinez asked straightforwardly, without intending to tease Emily Johnson but rather to address the matter directly. There's nothing between us." Emily Johnson blushed deeply, her face turning red as she lowered her gaze in embarrassment, trying to cover up her feelings. "Don't deny it. I know you better than that. If there's something there, just admit it. I'm not blaming you," Amelia Martinez said gently, holding Emily Johnson's hand as if she were her younger sister. "Really?" Emily Johnson looked up, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Seeing Amelia Martinez smiling back, she quickly looked down again, bashfully. Amelia Martinez stopped teasing and moved to sit beside Emily Johnson. "I have no objections about you and Brother James Smith. It's just, Amelia Martinez hesitated, as if finding it difficult to express her thoughts. Emily Johnson's heart felt like it was blooming with joy. Over the past days, James Smith had been by her side, caring for her diligently, and she had quietly grown fond of him. If not for her fear of upsetting her lady, she wouldn't have kept it hidden this long. Now, with Amelia Martinez's support, she no longer felt shy. She eagerly asked, "Just what?" "Emily Johnson, I'd like to ask for your help with something," Amelia Martinez said, her expression turning serious. She wasn't sure if Emily Johnson would agree. "Miss, whatever you need, please just say it." "As long as it's within my power, even if I must risk my life," Emily Johnson replied, filled with determination and enthusiasm, envisioning a future with James Smith. As she spoke, she even stood up, pledging her commitment. Amelia Martinez quickly stood up and covered Emily Johnson's mouth. Even though it was just a moment of emotional expression, she would never let Emily Johnson risk her life for her. She didn't want to hear such solemn vows, especially since Emily Johnson had always been so devoted and had almost lost her life twice because of her. Amelia Martinez couldn't bear the thought of Emily Johnson suffering any harm, otherwise, her own conscience would never be at peace. Emily Johnson lowered her head, realizing she had spoken too gravely, and waited for Amelia Martinez to speak. "Emily Johnson, tomorrow, I need you to stay close to James Smith and help me monitor them," Amelia Martinez finally said. She had thought long about this on the carriage. Although this might hinder Henry Blackwood's plan, she couldn't bear to see Charles Blackwood facing any danger so close to her. "Monitor them?" Emily Johnson gasped, wide-eyed in surprise. She quickly covered her mouth, glanced around to ensure no one was listening, then whispered, "Miss, why do we need to monitor them? Please don't ask any more about it. Just stay close to Brother James Smith and don't leave his side. If you notice anything unusual, come tell me first, don't inform the Crown Prince." Amelia Martinez didn't want to explain further, knowing it would only complicate things. She just instructed Emily Johnson to stay close to James Smith. Obedient as always, Emily Johnson nodded without further questioning, adopting Amelia Martinez's serious demeanor. Only then did Amelia Martinez feel reassured. Though she refrained from asking, Emily Johnson's mind was racing with questions. She had long sensed an air of conflict between her lady and James Smith, but now, Amelia Martinez was asking her to monitor Brother James. Could it be that Brother James and Sister Ava Wilson were actually villains? The thought startled Emily Johnson so much that she shook her head vigorously, scolding herself for such nonsense. Brother James Smith and Sister Ava Wilson couldn't possibly be bad people. "Emily Johnson, don't worry. Brother James Smith will be fine," Amelia Martinez said, noticing Emily Johnson's anxious expression. She tried to reassure her, then continued in a casual tone, "They are simply carrying out their duties for their respective masters." Although Emily Johnson heard Amelia Martinez's words, she didn't fully grasp the meaning behind them. But knowing that James Smith would be safe put her mind at ease. At that moment, the food was brought in, and it was Charles Blackwood himself who delivered it. Amelia Martinez was resting on the bed, and Emily Johnson opened the door, softly greeting the Crown Prince before glancing back at Amelia Martinez, who lay resting. Charles Blackwood placed a finger to his lips, signaling for Emily Johnson to stay quiet, and she nodded in understanding. He relaxed, stepped quietly into the room, and then sent Emily Johnson away to have her meal. Emily Johnson understood immediately, and with the task Amelia Martinez had entrusted her with, quickly slipped out. As soon as Emily Johnson left, Amelia Martinez sat up. Charles Blackwood was treading carefully, but was caught off guard seeing her awake. For a moment, he didn't know how to resume a normal pace until Amelia Martinez let out a soft laugh, causing him to realize what had happened. He said, "I thought I had disturbed your rest. I was almost asleep, but when I heard you open the door, I woke up," Amelia Martinez explained. Indeed, she had been drifting off and had dreamed that someone was entering the room. In the dream, it had been Charles Blackwood, and then she woke up, not expecting the dream to become reality. "Well then, come have a little to eat," Charles Blackwood offered, smiling gently. "No, thank you." Amelia Martinez shook her head, as she wasn't particularly hungry. But Charles Blackwood was unwilling to let her off so easily, leaning closer to her and saying, "Or are you waiting for me to feed you?" "No, no." Amelia Martinez finally relented. She wasn't that hungry, but didn't want Charles Blackwood to end up feeding her. Looking around and noticing Emily Johnson had left to eat, she admitted, "Actually, I am feeling a bit hungry." Charles Blackwood smiled with satisfaction, watching Amelia Martinez get up from bed to eat on her own, his arms folded across his chest, his gaze tenderly following her. Noticing that she seemed to be looking for Emily Johnson, he spoke up, "Emily Johnson has already gone downstairs to eat." Amelia Martinez nodded slightly, then took a large bite of rice. "Eat a bit more, especially the meat," Charles Blackwood gently reminded from beside her. After finishing her bite, Amelia Martinez replied, "Once, I was eating meat and found a hair on it, so I spat it out right away. Ever since then, just the sight of meat makes me lose my appetite." "Oh. Really? Where did that happen? Tell me, and I'll personally go handle it," Charles Blackwood said, pretending to be angry. Amelia Martinez knew he was only trying to cheer her up. Although the story wasn't particularly funny, she still cooperated by offering a soft smile. Seeing her smile, Charles Blackwood sat down next to her and reached out, attempting to hold her hand. Amelia Martinez pretended to say that sitting so close made her feel too warm and shifted to the side. Charles Blackwood didn't mind and simply sat there, saying, "You're too thin, you need to nourish yourself more." Amelia Martinez just smiled without saying anything. She thought, being too thin isn't good, but being too plump isn't ideal either. She sighed and said casually, "Actually, I still think I'm a bit heavy. There are people who go to great lengths to lose weight, even to the point of refusing to eat or undergoing surgery." Charles Blackwood furrowed his brow, surprised by her casual remark. Suddenly, he grabbed her arms tightly, startling Amelia Martinez. She glared at him, but before she could say anything, he spoke first, "I forbid you to do that. Just eat well, even if you gain weight, you'll still look lovely." Amelia Martinez fiercely pulled her arms away, picked up her bowl, and moved to sit across from Charles Blackwood, pretending to be angry as she said, "Are you crazy? I'm not that idle." Charles Blackwood took her words seriously. Seeing her agree, he finally let out a sigh of relief. Surgery to cut away fat for weight loss? Those women must be insane. He shook his head dismissively, glancing at Amelia Martinez's petite frame and wondering how much weight she might have tried to lose. Seeing him staring at her intently, Amelia Martinez knew what he was thinking and shot him a fierce look before firmly ushering Charles Blackwood out of the room. Amelia Martinez finally enjoyed a rare, restful night's sleep. When she awoke the next morning, she noticed that the sky had calmed again. Although the windows were shut tightly, a fine layer of yellow sand still covered the tabletop. Through the window, she could see that the dust storm had subsided. True to the innkeeper's word, her room provided an excellent view of the sunrise. She saw a crimson sun slowly rising in the east and quickly freshened up before heading downstairs. Downstairs, she encountered the innkeeper. Noticing her cheerful expression, he guessed that she intended to view the sunrise, but he courteously asked, "Miss, are you going out to watch the sunrise? Amelia Martinez nodded. Since the innkeeper had provided her with a truly good room, she felt particularly warm toward him. She asked, could you suggest the best spot to watch the sunrise? Amelia Martinez bowed to thank the innkeeper and headed toward the spot he had pointed out. Last night, in the darkness, the place had already looked barren and desolate. But now, as dawn broke, she could truly feel the wildness of the land. Though it wasn't quite a full desert, the golden sand swirled through the air, mingling into every breath. Sparse patches of vegetation were scattered here and there, but they were insignificant in the vast sea of sand. Holding up the hem of her skirt delicately, Amelia Martinez walked slowly up the small hill behind the inn, occasionally covering her mouth and nose to shield herself from the dust. Luckily, it wasn't far, and just by standing atop the hill, she could take in the entire view. At that moment, the sun had just begun to rise, casting a brilliant red glow across the land in front of her. But even this red hue was veiled by a faint layer of yellow, as if a layer of impurities had been added. The sunrise here wasn't all that different from the sunrises she had seen before, yet Amelia Martinez couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The sun had risen countless times, but how many thousands of years separated her from the world she once knew? The sun still rose and set, yet everything else had long since changed. What's got you looking so melancholic? Charles Blackwood's voice sounded suddenly behind her, startling Amelia Martinez. She turned to see him standing there, dressed in white, watching her closely. She scolded him, can't you make some noise when you walk? Always in white, are you trying to look like a ghost? Charles Blackwood was caught off guard, momentarily speechless. Just moments ago, she had been lost in sorrow, and now she had enough spirit to fire off remarks at him like a string of pearls. Amelia Martinez sensed she may have gone too far but wasn't about to admit it. She turned back and sat down, gazing at the now brilliant sun, which seemed like a giant fiery mouth consuming the landscape. I once saw the desert at sunset, but I never thought a sunrise could be just as beautiful, Charles Blackwood said, sitting down beside her, lost in his own thoughts. Amelia Martinez said nothing. Charles Blackwood noticed her silence and didn't press further, allowing himself to be absorbed in the scene before him. The vast desert is lonely, the great river sees a perfect sun at dusk. This sunrise feels just as poetic, Amelia Martinez murmured, as if speaking to herself, though perhaps also sharing her thoughts with Charles Blackwood. Charles Blackwood responded, a lovely verse. I wonder who wrote it. Amelia Martinez shot him a sideways glance and replied, you wouldn't understand even if I told you. Suddenly, Charles Blackwood stood up, without responding to her remark. Just as Amelia Martinez wondered what he was doing, she heard him call out sharply, watch out. He pushed her to the side just as several figures in black appeared, surrounding him. This wasn't the first time she had seen such a scene. Remembering how Charles Blackwood had been injured last time while protecting her, she felt a surge of anxiety. There were still 4 or 5 black-clad men preparing to attack, altogether, 7 or 8 men in black. No matter how skilled Charles Blackwood was, it would be difficult for him to fend off so many alone. Amelia Martinez immediately turned to rush back toward the inn for help. But the leader of the black-clad men quickly caught onto her plan, and with a single gesture, he ordered one of his men to block her path. Seeing that they didn't intend to kill her, the last shred of hope faded from Amelia Martinez's heart. If these men weren't sent by Ko Trong Leet, then who else could they be? Amelia Martinez let out a cold laugh, knowing they wouldn't dare do anything too drastic to her, so she wasn't truly afraid. She watched Charles Blackwood's agile figure move among the black-clad men, his white robe standing out starkly, now stained with blood. She couldn't tell if it was his or theirs. Then, something happened that no one could have anticipated. Taking advantage of a brief moment of inattention from one of the black-clad men beside her, Amelia Martinez grabbed a blade and turned it on herself. The black-clad man reacted quickly, reaching forward, but Amelia Martinez took a step back, looking fiercely at the leader who was still on the slope above. She commanded, "Tell them to stop." The black-clad men didn't cease their attacks, and those around her seemed ready to wrest the weapon from her. Meanwhile, Charles Blackwood, amidst his fight, spotted Amelia Martinez pressing the blade to her neck, though he couldn't tell what she intended. He heard her shout once more, "Stop," as she let the blade cut deeper, with blood starting to trickle down. Understanding her intentions, Charles Blackwood was both shocked and moved. So, she knew these men were sent by Henry Blackwood, and now her only way to save him was to threaten her own life. But as he pieced it together, a deeper shock struck him. Could it be that she had already realized his true purpose in bringing her along? Not wanting to think further, Charles Blackwood threw himself into the fight. This time, all he wanted was for Amelia Martinez to hold on and not act recklessly. While he fought, he shouted, "Amelia, don't." But Amelia Martinez didn't seem to hear him. She saw that the black-clad men merely watched her, without any intention to stop. She realized that this small amount of bloodshed wasn't enough to truly threaten her life. They weren't going to let this opportunity slip away. Resolute, she closed her eyes, and though she caught a flash of alarm in the leader's eyes, he couldn't stop her as she thrust the blade into her chest. Blood flowed down from the wound. With a faint smile, Amelia Martinez looked at Charles Blackwood. She saw a mixture of shock, anger, and concern in his face. Just that little bit of emotion was enough for her. However, the leader of the black-clad men wasn't about to let this chance slip by. As Amelia Martinez collapsed, the leader struck at Charles Blackwood's shoulder while he was momentarily distracted. You'd better let him take me for treatment, or, if he holds you responsible, none of you will escape punishment, Amelia Martinez managed to utter before losing consciousness, collapsing to the ground like a fallen leaf. Blood continued to pour from her, staining the sand red, almost challenging the crimson sun above. "Amelia!" Charles Blackwood let out a howl of despair. Even the black-clad men paused momentarily. In that instant, Charles Blackwood spun through the 4 men around him, and before they knew what had happened, they all collapsed. The leader of the black-clad men instinctively took a step back, stunned. The assassins he had brought were all highly trained, yet they had been felled as effortlessly as chickens. He realized that if he were to face Charles Blackwood directly, he might not even have a chance. He raised his hand in a silent command, and his subordinates quickly retreated into the distance. They cast a glance at Amelia Martinez lying in a pool of blood, a flicker of unease crossing their faces. With a wound to her chest, if anything happened to her, there would be no explaining it. Before leaving, Henry Blackwood had sternly ordered that not a single hair on her head should be harmed, under pain of death. The leader of the black-clad men shivered at the thought. He was the one who had reported to Henry Blackwood that he had lost track of Amelia Martinez the previous day, and he remembered Henry Blackwood's fury. Her importance to him was evident. Now, with her life hanging by a thread, he feared he wouldn't be able to explain this. It seemed he would have to ask Ava Wilson and his siblings for help, hoping they wouldn't report back to Henry Blackwood. With a heavy sigh, the leader vanished from Charles Blackwood's sight. This woman, he thought, truly brought calamity with her beauty, ensnaring 2 powerful men in her web. If his lord's plans were to fail, it would surely be due to this woman. "Amelia, Amelia!" Charles Blackwood hurriedly scrambled down the slope, seeing Amelia Martinez lying in a pool of blood. The sunrise was at its peak, casting a brilliant light over everything. But Charles Blackwood had no mind to admire it now. Amelia Martinez was already unresponsive. He quickly pressed her acupoints to stop the bleeding, but though it helped slow the flow, blood still continued to seep through. At that moment, Ronald Blackwood, along with Ava Wilson and James Smith, heard the sounds of the fight and Charles Blackwood's anguished cry. They rushed over, swords in hand, only to find the black-clad attackers had already fled, leaving 4 bodies behind. Charles Blackwood, covered in blood, knelt in the dirt, cradling Amelia Martinez. Everyone felt the gravity of the situation. Ava Wilson reached Charles Blackwood first, noting the pallor of Amelia Martinez's face as she lay in his arms. Quickly, Ava Wilson took her pulse and assessed her wounds. Without a word, she lifted Amelia Martinez and sprinted back toward the inn. Charles Blackwood remained motionless, still crouched as if he were holding Amelia Martinez. James Smith followed close behind Ava Wilson, leaving only Ronald Blackwood standing nearby. "Brother, you're injured too. Let's go back and get you looked at," Ronald Blackwood finally said, noting that the blood staining his brother's robes was not all Amelia Martinez's. He moved closer to support him. Charles Blackwood didn't respond. Ronald Blackwood settled beside him. He wasn't sure what had happened, but seeing Charles's dazed expression and Amelia Martinez's condition, he could only guess she had sacrificed herself to save his brother. A warmth stirred within him, but Ronald Blackwood still felt no remorse or regret toward Amelia Martinez. At most, he felt a faint tinge of surprise and pity. Charles Blackwood staggered to his feet, seeming completely lost. When Ronald Blackwood reached out to steady him, Charles shook him off, fiercely. Unable to remain silent, Ronald Blackwood thought of Lacknock waiting back at home, her heart pinned to Charles. And here was his brother, falling apart over a mere pawn. Could it be that he had actually fallen for her? The thought broke through all restraint. For the first time, Ronald Blackwood dared to confront Charles. Though he had always obeyed his elder brother without question, he now found the courage to speak, for Lacknock's sake and her future happiness. "Charles Blackwood, get a hold of yourself. Remember, she's nothing but a pawn." Ronald Blackwood gripped his brother's shoulders, shouting. Charles Blackwood stared at him, shocked. Then, as if overtaken by fury, he grabbed Ronald Blackwood's collar, gritting his teeth and pronouncing each word with chilling clarity. "What did you say?" She's nothing but a pawn." "That's right. She's just a pawn. Have you forgotten the real reason you brought her along? Or have you truly fallen for her?" Ronald Blackwood's voice did not waver, though a tremor ran through him as he met Charles's rage-filled eyes. He thought of Lacknock, telling himself that even if he had to risk his life, he would protect her happiness. No matter his brother's fury, he had to ask, could he really have fallen in love with that woman? Charles Blackwood froze, staring at Ronald Blackwood, then collapsed to his knees, despair overwhelming him. The image of Lacknock flashed through his mind, the woman to whom he had pledged his life, the woman whom he had promised to Ronald Blackwood to protect and cherish. But what about Amelia? What would become of her? He clutched his head, tormented, as tears finally spilled from his eyes. Seeing Charles starting to calm down, Ronald Blackwood approached and patted his shoulder, showing no resentment over their earlier scuffle. "Come on, brother. Let's go back. Maybe there's still hope for her." Those words seemed to snap Charles back into focus. Without another word, he bolted towards the inn. He didn't respond to Emily Johnson, who had come looking for them. His only thought was to reach Amelia Martinez as quickly as possible. She could not die. He wouldn't allow it. When he reached the inn, the doctor was just about to leave. Charles grabbed him tightly, demanding, "How is she?" The doctor, recognizing the prince, tried to bow, but Charles cut him off sharply, his tone laced with desperation. "Well, Your Highness, the young lady has lost a great deal of blood, and her injury is near the heart, just get to the point." Charles's voice thundered, leaving the doctor trembling. "If she isn't treated immediately, I'm afraid I can only temporarily stem the bleeding. Without proper treatment, her life may be in grave danger." Charles felt as if lightning had struck him. His grip slackened, and the doctor collapsed to the floor. At that moment, Ronald Blackwood entered the room, but before he could speak, Charles was already racing upstairs, repeating to himself, "Amelia Martinez, you cannot die. I forbid it." He was almost at the door when James Smith stepped in his way, his face expressionless as he blocked Charles's path. "Your Highness, it would be best if you didn't go in right now," he said sternly. "Move." Charles's gaze was fierce, his voice chilling as he issued the command. James Smith remained firmly in place. "Ava Wilson ordered that no one should enter," he replied, unwavering. Amelia Martinez was still in critical condition, and he couldn't allow anyone to disturb her recovery. If she were to die, he and Ava Wilson would bear the consequences. Standing behind Charles, Emily Johnson had witnessed the standoff. She had never seen James Smith look so cold, and she couldn't help but cry out, "Brother James Smith." James Smith glanced at Emily Johnson briefly, his expression softening for just a moment before hardening again as he turned back to face Charles. Part of him wished he could end this conflict once and for all, but his loyalty kept him rooted to the spot. Seeing an opportunity in James Smith's momentary distraction, Charles swiftly grabbed his throat. "Don't!" Emily Johnson screamed. But Charles merely scoffed, tossing James Smith aside and heading toward the door. Just then, the door opened on its own. Ava Wilson stood in the doorway. "Amelia is changing. What's all this noise outside?" she remarked, her voice carrying a trace of disdain as she looked at Charles. Then, without another word, she stepped aside, granting him entry. Charles Blackwood stepped quickly into the room, his gaze falling on the basin of blood-stained water and a pile of clothing soaked in red. His heart tightened with a painful jolt, and he fought to hold back his emotions as he moved closer to Amelia Martinez's side. Her face had lost all color, void of any signs of life. Remembering the doctor's words, Charles Blackwood shouted out orders to those outside, "Prepare everything, we depart immediately." Standing silently nearby, Ronald Blackwood observed his brother with growing concern. Charles Blackwood has truly fallen for her, but what of Lacknock? This thought gnawed at him, pushing him to seek an opportunity to act. Charles Blackwood watched over Amelia Martinez, gently whispering her name in hopes of rousing her from unconsciousness. But it was all in vain. Her eyes remained closed, her skin pale and cold. For the first time, he felt a profound pain within his chest, a deep regret over bringing her into this dangerous game and allowing himself to fall for her. He wished, more than anything, that she would open her eyes, tease him or roll her eyes at him like she used to, or even scold him playfully. Anything but lying there so still. "Tai Tu, we're ready," someone called from outside. "I understand. Depart immediately." Charles Blackwood forced himself to answer, his voice barely steady. Gently, he draped an outer robe over Amelia Martinez and wrapped her carefully in his arms, fearful of disturbing her wound. With measured steps, he descended the stairs, holding her closely as if she might fade away if he loosened his grip. Onlookers quickly parted, creating a silent pathway for him. From his place in the lead carriage, Ronald Blackwood watched it all with unease. He could clearly see Charles Blackwood's sorrow and remorse in his expression. A sigh escaped him as he pondered, wondering if choosing this path had been the right decision after all. The convoy pressed westward, racing across the vast, barren land. Charles Blackwood held Amelia Martinez close, his gaze fixed on her face, hoping for some miracle to bring her back to consciousness. But her eyes remained closed, and her face showed no signs of warmth. Several times he leaned out to yell, "Faster!" Throughout the night, the convoy didn't stop, pushing relentlessly toward the kingdom of Noy. Yet Amelia Martinez's body continued to cool in his arms, her warmth fading, until Charles Blackwood felt tears fall from his eyes for the first time. He clung to her tightly, trying to use his own warmth to rekindle the life within her. The doctor came in periodically to change her bandages, but each time his efforts appeared in vain. Charles Blackwood's anger grew fiercer with each failure, and if not for the other's intervention, the doctor might have faced harsh punishment. The rest of the entourage remained cautious, each person taking care to avoid the wrath of their prince. Emily Johnson, despite her deep worry for Amelia Martinez's condition, chose to ride on horseback beside James Smith. She was determined to carry out the task her mistress had given her, but more than that, she didn't want to remain inside the carriage, trapped in the same heavy atmosphere. "Are you all right, Emily Johnson?" James Smith asked in a soft tone, noticing her silence. He knew that his earlier intense gaze must have unsettled her, as she hadn't spoken to him since. Emily Johnson looked up at him and forced a weak smile, shaking her head. James Smith's uncharacteristically sharp look had left her wary. Originally, she thought him to be gentle, but this shift had shown her another side of him, one she hadn't expected. It was like the prince, who she had once dared to tease and joke with, but now, after seeing his expression as though he was about to devour the world, she wouldn't dare provoke him again. As they rode through the night without rest, the convoy finally reached the kingdom of Noyet by midday the following day. A welcoming party had been sent in advance by the kingdom, with court physicians on standby. Upon assessing Amelia Martinez's injuries, one of the doctors shook his head slightly. Alarmed, Charles Blackwood quickly pulled the physician aside, asking, "Well, how is she?" The physician replied, "Your Highness, the young lady's injuries are severe, and the strain of travel has worsened her condition. She must be taken to the palace for a thorough examination." Charles Blackwood's anxiety eased, if only a little, as he looked at Amelia Martinez's pale, lifeless face. At least the doctor hadn't said she was beyond saving. He whispered to her as if she could hear. "You mustn't die, Amelia. I forbid it." Without delay, the group hurried to the palace, finally arriving about an hour later. Inside, all of the kingdom's finest doctors had been summoned and were prepared to treat her. As soon as Amelia Martinez was brought in, they gathered around her urgently. Outside, Charles Blackwood paced back and forth, visibly distressed. Ronald Blackwood approached, trying to comfort him. "Brother, try to have faith." Even King Matthew Garcia of Noyet approached, saying, "Your Highness, please rest assured. These physicians are the best our kingdom has, I'm sure the young lady will recover." At last, the door opened, and a white-bearded physician stepped out. After bowing to the prince, he reported, "The young lady's injuries are severe, but thankfully, we have special healing ointments here in Noyet that have stopped the bleeding. As for when she will awaken, well, it could be soon, or it may take time. Whether she wakes at all will depend on her fate." The cautious words left Charles Blackwood's heart sinking again. He quickly strode forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "Fate? Then what is the purpose of all you so-called doctors? Guards! Drag this incompetent man out for execution." The physician dropped to his knees, begging for mercy, while Matthew Garcia looked on, somewhat embarrassed. After all, this was his palace, and Charles Blackwood had no authority to mete out punishment here. Realizing his overstep, Charles Blackwood calmed himself with a grunt, "Forget it, leave." Then he turned to Matthew Garcia, "Forgive my impatience, Your Majesty. I spoke out of worry." King Matthew Garcia laughed politely, dismissing the matter. He silently approved of Charles Blackwood's demeanor. He certainly had the bearing of a true leader. Charles Blackwood quickly entered the room, taking in the sight of Amelia Martinez lying there, as pale as death. He could scarcely contain his frustration at the physicians, who had merely told him to rely on fate. His mind swirled in turmoil as he held her hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing it repeatedly. In the past, she would have slapped him for being so forward, perhaps even scolded him. But this time, no matter how he whispered her name, there was no response from the figure lying on the bed. At that moment, Emily Johnson entered and saw Charles Blackwood murmuring softly to Amelia Martinez, a pained look on his face. The sight brought tears to her eyes, and she thought with regret, "If only I had stayed with her that morning, I could have taken her place." "Your Highness, Prince Ronald is requesting your presence to discuss important matters," Emily Johnson whispered respectfully. Charles Blackwood forced himself to hold back his tears. Reluctantly, he glanced down at Amelia Martinez, his voice barely more than a murmur, "Wait for me. I'll be right back." He rose to his feet and instructed Emily Johnson, "Watch over her carefully." Emily Johnson nodded obediently, watching him leave before she sat by Amelia Martinez's side. She gently took her mistress's hand, softly wiping it clean as she spoke, "Miss, look how much the prince cares for you. Please, wake up soon. I've never met anyone as kind as you. Please, I beg you to wake up." She choked on her words, tears flowing freely as she spoke. Still, Amelia Martinez showed no sign of life. After a while, Emily Johnson stood to fetch fresh water but found James Smith waiting in her path. Emily Johnson hurriedly wiped his tears and was about to take a different path, but unexpectedly, James Smith blocked his way and asked, "Why are you crying again? Is Amelia feeling any better?" Not saying it was one thing, but once mentioned, Emily Johnson couldn't hold back his tears. Sobbing, he replied, "Brother James Smith, Miss still hasn't shown any response. Do you think she'll never wake up?" James Smith felt his heart sink as well. He had heard the imperial physician's words earlier, "Let her fate decide," which practically meant leaving it up to the heavens. James Smith clenched his fists, pounding hard on the pillar, recalling the incident yesterday when the man in black even had the nerve to approach him for leniency. But now, with her still unconscious, he couldn't even protect himself, let alone advocate for someone else. Thinking of this, James Smith struck the pillar again with force. Emily Johnson was so terrified by James Smith's actions that he even forgot to cry, with only silent tears streaming down his face. James Smith regained his senses and saw Emily Johnson looking at him with a face full of fear. Realizing his actions must have scared him, he quickly said, "I promised Ava Wilson I would protect her younger sister, yet now she's hanging on by a thread. I truly deserve to die." Upon hearing that it was because of this, Emily Johnson set aside his sorrow and hastily consoled him, "Brother James Smith, this isn't your fault. I believe that Miss is blessed and will surely wake up." James Smith could only nod, letting out a deep sigh as he looked up to the heavens. "I hope so." Just as he lifted his head, he suddenly noticed a shadow stealthily entering Amelia Martinez's room, and his heart instantly filled with dread. Who could it be that dared to harm Amelia Martinez? Without delay, he grabbed Emily Johnson and hurried back. Emily Johnson didn't know what was going on, but seeing James Smith so tense, he stayed silent and followed him at a quick pace. The two stopped outside Amelia Martinez's room, and peered through a crack in the door, only to find that it was Ronald Blackwood. James Smith motioned for Emily Johnson to remain quiet so they could see what he intended to do. Ronald Blackwood seemed to inspect Amelia Martinez's condition briefly, then discreetly swapped her medicine bottle before preparing to leave. James Smith and Emily Johnson quickly stepped aside, watching as Ronald Blackwood slowly departed. Only after he left did Emily Johnson breathe a sigh of relief and ask, "What was Lord Ronald doing?" James Smith shook his head, and once he confirmed that Ronald Blackwood had gone, he entered the room with Emily Johnson to look at the white porcelain bottle identical to the one from before, but now feeling suspicious, he remarked, "Did the imperial physician change the medicine again? Why not ask to find out?" Emily Johnson also felt a bit uneasy. If he was just changing the medicine, there was no need to act so secretively. James Smith nodded, instructing Emily Johnson to watch over Amelia Martinez closely without leaving her side to prevent anyone else from approaching, while he went to find someone who could identify the medicine. In the main hall. "I understand your purpose for coming," said Matthew Garcia as he sat on the throne, gazing at the two distinguished-looking individuals seated below him. Although he had long favored the Crown Prince, he maintained a cautious approach for security's sake and asked, "But I wonder which of you?" Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood exchanged glances before Ronald Blackwood rose, bowed respectfully, and said, "It is I, Ronald Blackwood." Though Matthew Garcia kept a smile on his face, he was already feeling somewhat displeased. By custom, the Northern Exile Kingdom's intention to form an alliance through marriage was supposed to bolster Charles Blackwood's position as Crown Prince. Yet now, they were proposing a marriage with a prince instead of the Crown Prince, which, though they shared the same mother, did not carry the same weight as the role of a future empress. Reluctantly, Matthew Garcia nodded, appearing to show approval. However, to ensure the long-term stability of Ujungwa Kingdom, he knew he would have to consider the situation carefully. Given the internal strife in northern Exile, the Crown Prince was in desperate need of military support. Making a few demands at this time wouldn't be unreasonable. Matthew Garcia said, "The Crown Prince and the Prince have just arrived in Ujungwa Kingdom. During these days, you may explore around. My daughter will return to the palace in no more than 3 days, and we can discuss official matters then." Ronald Blackwood and Charles Blackwood exchanged glances, then said in unison, "Thank you very much." Matthew Garcia smiled and nodded, relieved that he had anticipated potential changes in the situation. Although he dared not oppose the marriage outright, he still held some power to resist slightly. Therefore, he had arranged for Tan Noye to leave the palace under the pretense of a ceremony to honor the ancestors, planning to decide on further steps when the time was right. Ronald Blackwood frowned and asked, "Brother, what do you make of this?" It was clear that Ronald Blackwood didn't fully believe what Matthew Garcia had said. Charles Blackwood also nodded, stepping forward a few paces and said, "Indeed, that old fox would hardly agree so easily. He's definitely plotting something, hoping to gain something from this opportunity. What could be more tempting than the Empress's throne?" Ronald Blackwood's expression grew serious, having already guessed most of Matthew Garcia's thoughts. In this situation, he was certainly hoping to borrow military support, and for the long-term interests of both nations, the role of queen would be the most fitting. Charles Blackwood furrowed his brows. He had thought of this as well, which was one reason for bringing Emilia Martinez along. Hopefully, that old fox would recognize the difficulty and back down. Charles Blackwood then said to Ronald Blackwood, "For now, don't make any rash moves, and keep an eye on James Smith and Ava Wilson's actions." Ronald Blackwood nodded, watching Charles Blackwood's figure as he walked away, likely heading to see Emilia Martinez. A barely perceptible sly smile appeared at the corner of Ronald Blackwood's mouth. Without that premium healing balm, let's see how Emilia Martinez would recover. Charles Blackwood moved quickly down the corridor, feeling for the first time that the journey was unusually long. He could hardly wait to see Emilia Martinez, to check if she had shown any improvement, to see if she had woken up. "Your Highness," Emily Johnson suddenly called out to him. At that moment, Charles Blackwood was burning with anxiety. Seeing someone call out and realizing it was Emily Johnson, his heart tightened, and he immediately stopped to ask, "How is Emilia?" "Your Highness, Miss still shows no sign of improvement." "It's just," Emily Johnson hesitated. Earlier, Brother James Smith had come to see her, saying that he had asked the imperial physician to check the medicine, and found that it was indeed different. "What is it?" "If it's not urgent, report it later." Seeing that it wasn't directly related to Emilia Martinez, Charles Blackwood lost interest and impatiently replied, "Yes." Emily Johnson quickly answered, hurrying to follow Charles Blackwood. Brother James Smith had warned her that the matter needed careful handling, otherwise, people might accuse her of stirring trouble between the two. Once inside, Emily Johnson quickly closed the door. As Charles Blackwood turned around and saw Emily Johnson had followed him in, he frowned, preparing to ask Emily Johnson to leave so he could be alone with Emilia Martinez. But Emily Johnson immediately knelt down, tears falling, and repeatedly kowtowed, saying, "Please forgive me, Your Highness. This matter is of great importance, I cannot remain silent." Charles Blackwood's heart sank, and he glanced at Emilia Martinez lying on the bed. In the end, he sat down beside her, and sternly said, "What is it? Speak." Emily Johnson looked around cautiously before speaking. Just now I saw someone intending to harm Mississippi. He secretly, who? Before Emily Johnson could finish, Charles Blackwood slammed his hand on the table, his face darkening with anger. Someone dared to plot against his woman right under his nose. This person must have a death wish. Charles Blackwood's sudden reaction startled Emily Johnson, who immediately bowed low, continuously begging for forgiveness. Charles Blackwood walked over to check on Amelia Martinez, noticing that her breathing had improved, at least no longer as erratic as before. He looked back at Emily Johnson, who was still kneeling on the ground, and shouted, "Speak the truth." "Your Highness, Emily Johnson, after assisting Miss with her wash and going to pour out the water, I discovered that someone had changed the medicine." "Who was it? Tell me." Charles Blackwood was already furious, and seeing Emily Johnson stammering, he grew even more enraged, determined to tear this person apart, whoever they might be. It was Prince Ronald Blackwood. "Please spare me, Your Highness, please spare me." Emily Johnson clenched her teeth, closed her eyes, and forced out her last breath of courage. She had made up her mind, even if it cost her life, it was worth it to protect Mississippi. Charles Blackwood was momentarily stunned, the teacup he was about to throw now gripped tightly in his hand, veins bulging as he processed this information. So, it was Ronald. At this thought, Charles Blackwood's anger gradually subsided. To ensure he hadn't misheard, he asked again in a harsh tone, "Are you certain of what you just said?" Kneeling below, Emily Johnson glanced up at Charles Blackwood in silence, trembling as fear took over her. She didn't know if he would believe her, but hearing him speak, even though his tone was harsh, reassured her a little. She quickly said, "Every word I've said is true." Charles Blackwood's mouth tightened as he asked coldly, "Does anyone else know about this?" Emily Johnson hesitated, unsure how to respond. Brother James Smith had instructed her not to mention that he knew. If the Crown Prince asked, she was to say that she was the only one who knew. But she feared that if he found out, it would be considered a crime against the throne. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, "Only I know, but I secretly consulted the imperial physician. He confirmed to me that the medicine had been tampered with." Only then did Charles Blackwood calm down a bit and said to Emily Johnson, "Don't speak of this to anyone. Do you understand?" Emily Johnson quickly bowed and replied, "Yes, Your Highness, I understand." At that, Charles Blackwood stood up and handed Emily Johnson the jade token he always carried, saying, "Keep this token. If I'm not here and someone tries to harm Miss, show them this." Emily Johnson nodded quickly, reaching out to take it, but Charles Blackwood withdrew his hand and cautioned, "Only show the token in truly critical moments." Emily Johnson nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she took the token and tucked it away in her robe. Charles Blackwood's stern expression softened as he took the medicine bottle Emily Johnson had just replaced and said, "From now on, if any medicine needs to be applied, inform me first. I'll check it before it's used." Emily Johnson nodded fervently before bowing out of the room. Once outside, she wiped her sweat, realizing her clothes were soaked through. "Emily Johnson, how did it go?" came James Smith's voice unexpectedly from behind her. Emily Johnson jumped in surprise, turning to see James Smith seemingly appear out of nowhere. She asked, surprised, "Brother James Smith, why are you here?" Saying this, she glanced toward Amelia Martinez's room, ensuring everything was all right, then pulled James Smith to a secluded corner down the corridor. "I couldn't stop worrying about you, afraid something might happen," James Smith said directly, his eyes filled with concern. Emily Johnson blushed immediately, but her heart was full of sweetness. She turned around and said, "Don't worry, Brother James Smith, I'm fine." James Smith also felt a bit embarrassed. Seeing Emily Johnson respond in this way, he quickly said, "That's good, that's good. I saw that the Crown Prince seemed angry, I was worried he wouldn't believe you." "Not at all. Although the Crown Prince was angry, it was out of concern for Mississippi naturally, he believed what I said," Emily Johnson replied quickly. She had indeed been quite scared earlier, but she didn't blame Charles Blackwood for it, understanding that he was worried about Mississippi. Seeing James Smith worried about the Crown Prince reprimanding her, she wanted to excuse the Crown Prince. "You always think of others first." James Smith, seeing Emily Johnson defending Charles Blackwood like this, couldn't help but smile and speak indulgently. Emily Johnson was shy again, quickly saying, "Brother James Smith, don't you have anything to do?" James Smith thought for a moment, then said, "I don't know any fun places in this palace, and there's nothing to do here. It's so boring." Emily Johnson nodded in agreement. She had only arrived today and had only explored this small courtyard without going out. Now, with the Crown Prince occupied with Miss, she couldn't find anything to do. She suggested to James Smith, "Why don't we just go for a walk?" James Smith was thinking the same thing, so the two readily agreed and soon disappeared into the palace gardens. Meanwhile, Ava Wilson stood under a tree, watching her brother and Emily Johnson laughing together. She felt a mix of emotions. Her brother wasn't young anymore, it was time for him to marry. But until the major tasks were complete, how could he let romantic feelings interfere? If the prince knew, her brother would surely be punished. She felt she should remind him. At the same time, Ava Wilson was also worried about Amelia. Even if the prince hadn't required her to protect Amelia, they had spent many sincere days together. She had long since come to see Amelia as her own sister. But because of certain incidents, her identity had been exposed, and Amelia had begun to doubt her and grew distant. Now, with Amelia's life in the balance, she didn't even know how to go in and see her. Henry Blackwood had vaguely heard about this situation and was waiting for her to report back. She was being closely monitored from all sides, and Amelia was also in a precarious condition. She truly didn't know how to explain this to Henry Blackwood. She thought that those men in black must have been dealt with by now. Thinking of this, Ava Wilson couldn't help but break into a cold sweat. Henry Blackwood was ruthless and vengeful, eliminating threats thoroughly, preferring to kill thousands mistakenly rather than let one escape. If Amelia didn't wake up, she and James Smith might have no choice but to atone with their lives. Amelia Martinez seemed to be having a very long dream. In it, she seemed to return to her old life, reading books, playing games, and occasionally fantasizing about time travel adventures. That version of Amelia Martinez appeared detached from her body, floating quietly above. She looked at the unconscious person with pity. Blood continued to flow from her wound like a gaping hole. She silently watched Amelia Martinez, her mouth moving as if trying to say something. But in the end, she only opened her mouth, mumbling incoherently. She began to mimic Amelia Martinez's lip movements, following her actions. The face remained smiling, repeatedly uttering a few phrases. Then, slowly, that figure, seemingly unwilling, merged back into the body lying there. Then, she seemed to regain some awareness and heard another voice calling her repeatedly, seemingly saying something, though it was a bit unclear, just an irritating noise. She tried to lift her hand but only managed a small movement, finding she had no strength at all. Summoning all her energy, she muttered, "Stop making noise, it's so annoying." Then, she drifted back into a deep sleep, and the surroundings returned to silence. Charles Blackwood stared blankly at everything, hardly daring to believe it. He shook Amelia Martinez gently, wondering if she had really spoken just now, but she was as still as if lifeless. Charles Blackwood couldn't be sure anymore. Was he so desperate for her to wake up that he had imagined it? He sat back down, trying to calm himself. Surely, he was just overthinking it. He held Amelia Martinez's hand and murmured, "Amelia, do you know? I think I might truly be in love with you. Can you wake up? If you wake up, we can talk about anything. Stop bothering me, so annoying." Amelia Martinez suddenly muttered again. At first, Charles Blackwood thought he was just hearing things. After a moment, he excitedly grabbed Amelia Martinez's hand, saying, "Amelia, you're awake. But Amelia Martinez remained unresponsive, leaving Charles Blackwood talking to himself. He didn't care and quickly ran outside, looking for Emily Johnson, but couldn't find her. He called over a nearby maid and asked her to fetch the imperial physicians immediately. The maid, seeing a man who was both elated and anxious clutching her arm, was initially startled. But upon realizing it was the crown prince, she guessed he must be talking about the severely injured young lady, and without a word, she quickly ran toward the imperial physicians' quarters. Upon hearing the news, the physicians rushed over one by one. Seeing the crown prince's unusual excitement, one of them quickly said, "Your Highness, allow me to examine her first." The other physicians nodded in agreement. Realizing he was being a bit too anxious, Charles Blackwood coughed a few times to compose himself and, in a more authoritative tone, said, "Very well, thank you." The physicians approached Amelia Martinez one by one, each conducting an examination. Finally, they gathered together. Charles Blackwood, who had been waiting nearby, grew impatient and raised his voice, "Well? Do you have any conclusions? She just spoke twice." A physician, who was a bit clueless, asked, "May I ask what the young lady said?" Charles Blackwood felt frustrated. How could he possibly tell them that she told him he was annoying and to stop bothering her? He put on a stern face and replied, "She spoke, that's all you need to know. Why do you care about the content? I've forgotten it myself." "That's unusual. The young lady's pulse has stabilized somewhat. If she spoke, she should have woken up fully. However, there are still no signs of her regaining full consciousness," said another physician tactfully, noticing Charles Blackwood's reluctance to disclose more details and quickly redirected to the medical report. "So, you're saying I heard wrong?" Charles Blackwood retorted, anger simmering. He was sure he had heard her twice. If he had misheard once, could he have misheard both times? The physicians quickly bowed and replied, "Your Highness, we wouldn't dare suggest that." Just then, Emily Johnson arrived after receiving the news. Seeing Charles Blackwood looking displeased, she quickly held herself back. She noticed the physicians bowing their heads and didn't understand what had happened, wondering if something was wrong with Amelia Martinez again. Otherwise, why would there be so many people gathered here? Emily Johnson quickly rushed forward, grabbing Amelia Martinez's hand and sobbing, "Miss, what's wrong with you? Please, wake up." Then, a miracle happened once again. Amelia Martinez, seemingly annoyed by Emily Johnson's cries, moved her hand slightly and muttered, "Stop it, you're so noisy." Everyone fell silent. Emily Johnson, face streaked with tears, turned to look at everyone else, and the imperial physicians exchanged glances. At that moment, Charles Blackwood became animated, as if trying to prove himself right, that he hadn't misheard. "See, I told you she spoke. Now, re-examine her. If you still don't find anything, be careful, or I might just have you all executed." Hearing this, everyone rushed forward again. They had all heard Amelia Martinez speak, but she still showed no signs of fully waking up. Emily Johnson stood there, momentarily at a loss. When the physicians gently pushed her aside, she finally said awkwardly, "It seemed like Miss spoke just now." Charles Blackwood nodded gravely, unsure if this was a good or bad sign. He had noticed Amelia Martinez's lips moving, as if she were mumbling something repeatedly, yet no sound came out. He leaned closer several times, but there was no response. Emily Johnson anxiously watched the physicians as they worked, but there was no notable change. Finally, an older physician, less afraid of speaking up, said, "Regardless, this is surely a good sign. I have a method we could try." "Speak," Charles Blackwood commanded in a concise, firm tone. "It appears that the young lady is sensitive to external sounds. Perhaps we can stimulate her continually with external noises. This may help her wake up sooner." Among the people, this method is known as soul calling, the old physician explained. Soul calling? Charles Blackwood raised his eyebrows, skeptical of this strange method. Nonetheless, he nodded and asked, "What exactly do we do?" "You take an iron container, put some peas inside, and shake it continuously," another elder physician quickly added, seeing that Charles Blackwood's expression had softened a bit. Emily Johnson immediately volunteered, "I'll go prepare it." With that, she hurried out and disappeared. After the physicians all respectfully took their leave, Charles Blackwood sat down beside Amelia Martinez once more. Everything that had just happened was not an illusion. He held Amelia Martinez's hand, gently warming it between his palms, and her body temperature gradually returned to normal. Emily Johnson soon returned, her preparations complete, and whispered to Charles Blackwood, "Your Highness, please rest. I'll take over." "No, I'll do it," Charles Blackwood replied, taking the iron container from her. He began shaking it steadily and rhythmically, his gaze never leaving Amelia Martinez, afraid he might miss even the slightest movement. Emily Johnson stood by, watching Charles Blackwood care for Miss in such a devoted way. She thought that Amelia Martinez was truly blessed to have him. Realizing her presence might be unnecessary, she quietly withdrew. As soon as she stepped outside, she found James Smith blocking the doorway. Surprised, she remarked, "Didn't I tell you not to come here to find me? Be careful, or the Crown Prince will see you." James Smith quickly followed Emily Johnson to a corner and whispered, "I'm just worried about Amelia." "How is she?" Emily Johnson sighed and replied, "Miss just spoke, but there's still no sign of her waking up. The Crown Prince is currently using the iron container to call her soul." Calling her soul? The Crown Prince actually believes in that? James Smith replied with a hint of skepticism. Emily Johnson seemed to sense the discontent and disdain in James Smith's tone, so she quickly explained, "No, the Crown Prince is deeply in love with Mississippi. That's why he's willing to try anything. Ah, it's really enviable to have someone love her so much." Suddenly, after she spoke, Emily Johnson felt a bit regretful. She stole a glance at James Smith out of the corner of her eye and noticed he was looking at her, which made her blush. "All right, you should go back now. I need to prepare dinner for the Crown Prince," she said, flustered. "Isn't the Crown Prince supposed to be dining with the Prince of Ujungwa tonight?" James Smith asked, noticing Emily Johnson's embarrassment and realizing she was trying to hide it with an excuse. He decided to play along, exposing her excuse to tease her. Emily Johnson felt even more embarrassed now that James Smith had seen through her excuse. She wriggled uncomfortably and said, "Oh, come on, brother James Smith, don't tease me like that." All right, James Smith laughed, enjoying her shy demeanor for some reason. Then, his expression turned serious as he said, "Emily Johnson, I need to borrow something from you." "What do you need, brother James Smith?" Emily Johnson asked, wondering what she had that would be of any use to him. "This afternoon, the Crown Prince gave you a token, didn't he? Lend it to me for a while, and I'll return it to you in the morning." James Smith finally revealed the true purpose of his visit. It was an urgent matter he had just learned about, and he didn't want to alarm anyone else. Emily Johnson immediately grew wary. She took a few steps back to put some distance between them and, ensuring her safety, asked, "How did you know? And why do you need it?" That afternoon, the Crown Prince had told her to keep it a secret, and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not even James Smith. So how did he know about it and come to borrow it? James Smith looked a bit uncomfortable and explained, "I happened to be nearby and overheard a bit." "Really?" Emily Johnson asked, but she still felt a little doubtful. She had checked outside carefully before speaking with the Crown Prince, and if anyone had been eavesdropping, surely the Crown Prince would have noticed. Seeing that Emily Johnson was still a bit skeptical, James Smith sighed and said, "I thought the person I love most would trust me, but it seems, brother James Smith, it's not that I don't trust you," Emily Johnson said, worried when she saw his reaction, and hurried to explain. Finally, seeing James Smith still leaning against the pillar silently, Emily Johnson grew a little afraid. She asked hesitantly, what do you need the token for, Brother James Smith? Hearing this, James Smith knew Emily Johnson was softening and there was a chance she would lend it to him. He sighed and said, I've been stuck here for days, unable to get away. I have a friend outside the palace I'd like to meet, but it's been impossible. Emily Johnson thought it over and saw no harm in lending it to him. She began to take out the token, but James Smith seized the opportunity to pull her into an embrace, facing the wall as he accepted the token from her. Emily Johnson blushed deeply, feeling a mix of excitement and shyness as she found herself so close to a man, even able to catch his scent. Brother James Smith. She stammered. James Smith, pretending as if nothing unusual had happened, glanced around to make sure no one was watching, all while holding the bashful Emily Johnson. In truth, he felt a bit awkward himself. If it weren't for avoiding the eyes of those monitoring him, he would never have taken such an intimate approach. James Smith looked at Emily Johnson's shy face, then leaned in to kiss her forehead lightly before releasing her and saying, You'll be just as happy as Miss Amelia someday. Now go back. Emily Johnson, her face flushed, quickly stood up, gave a soft response, nodded, and then disappeared into the night. She didn't know how long she ran before slowing down. Thinking about the scene just now, when James Smith held her close, so near that she could feel his heartbeat, she blushed again. The thought of it left her feeling both shy and sweet. She quietly scolded herself for being shameless, daydreaming, but in her heart, there was an undeniable warmth. James Smith watched as Emily Johnson disappeared swiftly into the darkness, her shy, charming smile lingering in his mind. He couldn't help but give a bitter smile. Closing his eyes, he touched the jade token in his chest and sighed. He hadn't wanted to deceive Emily Johnson, especially after seeing her pure smile. In the daytime, he had thought about giving her everything beautiful in the world, yet here he was at night, using the same words to deceive her. James Smith felt a pang of guilt. He didn't know if what he was doing was right or wrong. The image of Emily Johnson and her laughter lingered in his mind, and he felt remorse for what he had done to her, finally understanding the feeling of being helpless in one's own actions. If she had said she didn't have the jade token or refused to lend it, he would have thought of another way rather than using deception to take it from her. Brother, don't let emotions get involved, Ava Wilson, who had been watching everything from the shadows, said. She had seen every intimate gesture between them and had initially planned to let him regain his senses alone. But after seeing him sit there for so long, seemingly regretful over his actions toward Emily Johnson, she decided to step forward to remind him. James Smith turned, surprised, and upon seeing his sister, gave a bitter smile, I know. With that, James Smith walked ahead, and Ava Wilson followed behind. Ava Wilson, do you think I should tell Emily Johnson the truth? James Smith still felt uneasy. He feared that if Emily Johnson learned the truth the next day, she might never forgive him. Brother, think of the bigger picture, Ava Wilson replied, repeating the familiar advice. They had been warned against allowing emotions to interfere. Emotions were a dangerous poison, even deadlier than any other. Once entangled in feelings, there was no turning back. In their line of work, emotions were a vulnerability, remaining detached was crucial. Women were often the root of misfortune. Take this current situation, if Henry Blackwood had been ruthless, caring nothing for Amelia's fate, Charles Blackwood would surely be dead, clearing away any obstacles for Henry Blackwood to ascend the throne. But this time, emotions drove him to take the risky step of entering the palace to see a woman. From a strategic perspective, it was an unwise move, though perhaps a noble one from the perspective of love. Indeed, emotions could be deeply damaging. Even the crown prince had seemingly fallen into the trap, and for the same woman, no less. Both Henry Blackwood and Charles Blackwood were fine candidates for the throne, yet both had succumbed to the allure of love, especially to a woman's charms. The one who invested more emotionally would be more likely to fail. It seemed clear that no matter which man ultimately failed, it would be impossible for this woman to avoid being involved. Thinking of this, Ava Wilson sighed, recognizing that emotions were something best avoided. Once entangled, they would be impossible to escape. Seeing James Smith in such a daze, filled with regret, she knew he had likely fallen too deeply into this emotional trap. If this continued, it would surely impact future actions. "Brother, prepare yourself, the one coming to take over will arrive soon," Ava Wilson said, glancing at the sky before looking back at James Smith and finally reminding him. James Smith nodded, looking at the sky outside, murmuring to himself, "It's time." As soon as he finished speaking, a man dressed as a guard approached, grumbling to himself as he walked into the room. James Smith quickly bowed and said, "Thank you for your trouble." The newcomer, reeking of alcohol, seemed to be slightly drunk and in a foul mood. Seeing James Smith's respectful tone, he waved his hand impatiently and said, "Hurry up, don't dawdle." James Smith promptly agreed, then changed into the guard's uniform. After exchanging a quick look with Ava Wilson, he was about to leave when she called him back. James Smith turned to look at Ava Wilson, who sniffled, stepped closer, and said, "Be careful. When you see the prince, watch yourself, don't reveal anything about your situation." James Smith nodded firmly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Henry Blackwood never allowed his subordinates to develop attachments, as emotions could override reason, leading to rash decisions. Just like this time, James Smith had taken a great risk, traveling overnight from the Northern Kingdom to sneak into the palace, all to see the woman he loved. He understood Ava Wilson's concerns. With one last look at her, he staggered out, pretending to be drunk. James Smith had already familiarized himself with the palace layout and the placement of hidden guards. As he moved, he felt confident that even if discovered, he could handle it. 2 throwing knives would take out the guards in the flower beds and at the wall corners. The other 2 guards would likely emerge from the roof and the interior, 2 more knives, and it would be done. During the day, when he had taken Emily Johnson on a walk, he had memorized the area, so he moved quickly, slipping away from the secluded courtyard and disappearing into the palace grounds. A few of the hidden guards grew suspicious when they saw the drunken guard disappear so swiftly. How could a drunken man move that fast and vanish in the blink of an eye? Another hidden guard dismissed the concern, clearing his head with a slap and saying, "We don't know the palace well, maybe there's a shortcut or hidden path." And since the guards are allowed to drink, it's not that surprising. But, the first guard was still reluctant to let it go. He had been watching closely, and in just a blink, the guard was gone, it was too fast. "Oh, come on, we're here to watch that couple, not some random guard. Why are you so worried?" The other guard, clearly annoyed, reminded him that their job was to keep an eye on James Smith and Ava Wilson. They hadn't observed anything suspicious, and James Smith seemed to have no other purpose except for spending time with that maid beside the prince. But she was indeed quite beautiful, he mused, closing his eyes with satisfaction. Hearing this, the skeptical guard sighed and returned his focus to watching the room intently. Meanwhile, James Smith moved swiftly through the corridors and gardens, encountering no one. Occasionally, he saw a patrol, but he easily avoided them. After weaving through the palace complex long enough to ensure no one was following him, he finally arrived at the designated meeting point. It was quiet, with only the occasional flickering of lanterns, like ghost lights. The soldiers at the palace gate, however, remained alert, showing no sign of drowsiness. James Smith felt a surge of tension. Fortunately, he had the Crown Prince's jade token, otherwise, he wouldn't have known how to bring his master in. Thinking of this, James Smith couldn't help but recall Emily Johnson. She must be sleeping sweetly by now. How would he explain this to her tomorrow? Would she ignore him because of this? To be honest, he did have feelings for Emily Johnson, though he wasn't sure if these feelings would ever amount to anything real. The sound of the night watch's clapper abruptly pulled James Smith back to reality. It was now past midnight, a time when the guards were at their most fatigued. James Smith silently counted the beats and noticed some commotion at the palace gate. After confirming there was no one else around, James Smith swiftly approached the gate, where Henry Blackwood was waiting. Calming himself, James Smith walked over. The gate guards moved to block his path, but James Smith immediately produced the jade token and scolded them, "How dare you? Seeing the token, you should kneel." One of the guards, who seemed to have received prior instructions, glanced at the token and quickly knelt. The others followed suit. Seeing this, James Smith was satisfied and put the token away. He then said sternly, "This is a guest of His Highness the Crown Prince. You are not to be disrespectful." But, the lead guard seemed to have something more to say. "How bold of you to question the Crown Prince's matters. Aren't you afraid I'll report you to Prince Ujungwa?" James Smith raised his voice slightly to suppress any further objections. The guard immediately responded, "Forgive me, sir. I didn't mean any offense. I hope the Crown Prince won't hold it against us. Tonight's events must remain unspoken. Otherwise, the Crown Prince will not spare you," James Smith warned, then exchanged a glance with Henry Blackwood. With that, they safely entered the palace. "James Smith pays his respects to my lord," he said, bowing after confirming no one else was around. "Enough, be careful, someone might see us," Henry Blackwood replied coldly as usual, though this time with a hint of urgency. He quickly asked, "How is Amelia?" "The letter said she was much better." "Is it true?" "Reporting to my lord, things are as Ava Wilson described. This afternoon, Amelia Muoy, Miss even spoke, though she hasn't fully regained consciousness. The Crown Prince has been using an iron device to call her soul in hopes of waking her," James Smith replied truthfully, catching himself and adjusting his words when mentioning Amelia. "I see," Henry Blackwood nodded, his expression growing even more severe. "Take me to see her now," Henry Blackwood demanded. "My lord, perhaps it would be better to wait until tomorrow." "Right now, the Crown Prince is likely there," James Smith said with concern, knowing that the area was filled with the Crown Prince's people, and any misstep could arouse suspicion. Henry Blackwood scoffed coldly. He was well aware of Charles Blackwood's men surrounding the area and wasn't fazed in the slightest. With a sweep of his sleeve, he said, mildly irritated, "I don't need anyone's advice on what I should do." "Yes, sir," James Smith responded quickly. He realized he had spoken out of turn tonight. Henry Blackwood's words were law, with no room for negotiation. Typically, all James Smith needed to do was carry out orders, but because of the gravity of this situation, he couldn't help but voice a warning, which Henry Blackwood saw as overstepping. "I'll lead the way." With that, he disappeared into the darkness, with Henry Blackwood following close behind. At this moment, everything was silent, all around had fallen into a hunter's slumber. The secluded courtyard was especially quiet and serene. As they approached, the soft rustling sounds could already be heard. Charles Blackwood suddenly stopped and gestured for James Smith to stay put, then slowly moved closer to the building himself. A dark figure moved quickly at the doorway, its silhouette faintly visible through the paper screens. Henry Blackwood stood outside, silently watching the shadow moving inside. He knew it was Charles Blackwood. Right now, he desperately wanted to go in, to be by Amelia Martinez's side as she awoke so that he would be the first person she saw. Inside, Charles Blackwood stifled a yawn, yet his hands kept moving, rhythmically shaking the iron device as he softly called out Amelia Martinez's name over and over. Henry Blackwood felt a surge of jealousy. He had chosen that name specifically for her, and now to hear it spoken so affectionately from another man's lips made his blood boil. James Smith, who was waiting nearby, found it unbearable. Seeing Henry Blackwood standing silently at the door, he assumed his lord already knew what was going on inside. Fearing Henry Blackwood might lose control and rush in, James Smith seized a moment and crept up beside him, whispering, "My lord, let's go back for now." Henry Blackwood, his face darkened, glanced at James Smith and then continued forward. I'll let you stay by her side tonight, Charles Blackwood, he thought. It seems you've fallen for her, but no matter how hard you try, she's already my woman. All your efforts are in vain. Inside, Charles Blackwood, fighting exhaustion, continued to shake the iron device without a clue about what was happening outside. He only wished for Amelia Martinez to wake up soon. If he could do it all over, he would have regretted bringing her here. Even though she was merely a pawn, she had willingly played that role for him, which stirred a pang of guilt in his heart. If you knew everything, why were you so foolish? Why did you go through with it, risking your life? Was it to make me regret? Charles Blackwood thought painfully, shaking his head as he looked at Amelia Martinez, who occasionally muttered, "Don't disturb me." But she had grown silent again. Charles Blackwood sighed and shook the device even more vigorously. Emily Johnson had come by earlier, offering to take over for him, but for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to leave Amelia Martinez's side. He wanted her first sight upon waking to be him, Charles Blackwood. Outside, the sky was pitch black, with no stars or moon, like a vast curtain covering everything. Charles Blackwood's heart felt equally clouded, filled only with thoughts of Amelia Martinez, haunted by memories of her blood-stained figure and that final, heart-wrenching smile. He was deeply afraid of that smile, so radiant yet leaving him chilled, as though it were a silent message that she knew everything but chose to remain silent. "My lord, tomorrow Ava Wilson will arrange a chance for you to see her. You should get some rest," Ava Wilson said, noticing that the lights in Henry Blackwood's room had yet to go out, likely because he was still lost in thoughts of Amelia Martinez. "I understand," Henry Blackwood replied coldly, extinguishing the lamp in his room, along with a barely audible sigh. Ava Wilson stood outside for a long time, looking at the now darkened room. She knew Henry Blackwood was still awake, his heart entirely occupied by Amelia Martinez, leaving no room for anyone else. Ava Wilson sighed. If he truly loved her, then why push her away, choosing instead to guard her from afar, enduring the pain of longing while watching her smile for another man, who happened to be his mortal enemy? Ava Wilson couldn't understand Henry Blackwood's heart. If he wanted Amelia Martinez to return, she surely would. It would be a simple matter for him. If he hadn't married Princess Chi-Lin, then Amelia Martinez would likely be his wife, and they could have lived happily together. "You're still here, Ava Wilson," a voice suddenly said from inside the room. Though not as cold as usual, there was a faint trace of sorrow in it. "Yes, my lord, Ava Wilson will leave right away," Ava Wilson replied, surprised that Henry Blackwood was still aware of her presence. She turned to leave. "Ava Wilson, come in," Henry Blackwood suddenly called out. Ava Wilson stopped in her tracks, startled. Henry Blackwood had just asked her to come in. She couldn't help but open the door and step inside. The room was pitch black, and she carefully felt her way forward, but she accidentally bumped into a chair. "Just sit there," Henry Blackwood's voice spoke from the darkness. Ava Wilson had assumed he would be on the bed, but the voice revealed that he was actually by the window. She nodded, unsure if he could see her, then quickly replied in a soft voice, "Yes, my lord," before sitting down anxiously. "Of all those who work for me, only you, Ava Wilson, understand me best, even better than James Smith," Henry Blackwood sighed deeply, then slowly continued. Ava Wilson felt a surge of gratitude. She hadn't realized that everything she had done was noticed and remembered by Henry Blackwood. Feeling moved, she quickly said, "That's what Ava Wilson should do." Silence lingered in the darkness for a while. "How many years have you been with me?" Henry Blackwood suddenly asked. Ava Wilson, though unsure why he would ask such a question, answered honestly, "Since the 19th year of Vannon, my lord." "Is that so?" "It's already been 7 years," Henry Blackwood sighed, then, as if recalling something, he slowly continued, "I remember back then you were only 14 or 15 years old. So many years have passed in a flash. At that time, you were always playful and didn't want to train seriously like James Smith. One time, I punished you by not allowing you to eat until you finished your work, and you really went without food, refusing James Smith's help, and worked until dawn to complete everything. From then on, I knew you were stubborn and would never give in. Ava Wilson listened quietly, memories flooding back, and the distance between the two of them seemed to shrink. She felt as if she had returned to that time, those days of arguing and defying Henry Blackwood, enduring countless punishments without once begging for mercy. The memories brought a bittersweet feeling to her heart. I didn't expect my lord would still remember these things. Ah, I remember clearly everything you've done for me, Henry Blackwood said. Indeed, he remembered every detail, every favor, and every grudge. Everything was kept in his heart to be repaid in due time. He had always been a person who valued both rewards and consequences, fairness, and justice. Back then, James Smith told you to apologize to me, but not only did you refuse, you even pushed him into the lotus pond, Henry Blackwood added with a hint of amusement. Ava Wilson recalled the incident. It did seem like something that happened. She had done many things to trouble James Smith when they were younger, including one time when she accidentally left a large cut on his back, leaving him bedridden for more than 2 months. What Henry Blackwood mentioned was just one incident among many, and she only vaguely remembered it. I didn't think my lord would remember all of that, Ava Wilson murmured, her heart filled with mixed emotions as she remembered those days. Alas, those times were gone, never to return. Now, it seems that you're the only one I can talk to about matters of the heart, Henry Blackwood said suddenly. He walked over, lit a lamp, and sat down across from Ava Wilson. Suddenly, the lamp lit up, and Ava Wilson found herself sitting so close to Henry Blackwood that she felt uneasy, instinctively trying to shift away. She looked up at Henry Blackwood and, for some reason, found that in this dim light, his usually cold and unfeeling expression seemed unexpectedly gentle, making her want to draw closer. But even on his face, which tried to appear strong, there remained a faint sadness. I don't know if I'll regret this, Henry Blackwood murmured, almost to himself. He stood up and walked to the window, opening it. Outside, the darkness was even deeper, with a few lanterns flickering in the distance. Ava Wilson understood what Henry Blackwood was referring to but did not add her own opinion on right or wrong. Instead, she stood up and said, "If you've chosen to do this, you must have your reasons, my lord." Henry Blackwood turned around to face her, seemingly dissatisfied with her response. He moved closer to her and said, "You're different from before, but I miss the way you used to be." Ava Wilson understood well. Back then, she had been fearless, daring to say anything and do anything. She would always get involved if she saw something she didn't like. Amelia Martinez would often call her a passionate youth, always eager to stand up for what was right. But with age came lessons and punishments that slowly taught her to calm down. Who could continue to hold on to youthful defiance forever? "Leave," Henry Blackwood finally said with a hint of disappointment. He had hoped that Ava Wilson might give him her honest opinion, an answer he could hold on to. But she was no longer the Ava Wilson of the past, she had learned to accept everything in silence. "Your Highness, let me take over. You've been here all night. Please rest for a bit. Emily Johnson has just made some millet porridge for you," Emily Johnson said early in the morning as she entered the room. Hearing noises coming from within, she knew that the Crown Prince had not slept all night. Knowing that she had slept soundly while he stayed up, Emily Johnson felt a bit guilty and had hurriedly prepared porridge for him, hoping he would rest while she took care of Amelia Martinez. "It's fine," Charles Blackwood replied, stifling a yawn when he saw Emily Johnson. He switched the hand holding the iron device, giving it a shake to keep his spirits up. Emily Johnson was touched by Charles Blackwood's deep concern for Amelia Martinez. She brought the porridge closer and said, "Your Highness, have a sip here while I take over the shaking. If Miss wakes up, she'll still see you nearby." Feeling his hunger, Charles Blackwood glanced outside, seeing that dawn had broken. What Emily Johnson said made sense, so he nodded, handing over the iron device to Emily Johnson and instructed, "Shake it evenly, don't spill." Emily Johnson nodded earnestly, carefully taking the iron device and gently shaking it. As Charles Blackwood watched her, he began to pace around the room, holding the bowl of porridge. He hadn't realized that he had been shaking the device all night without feeling the strain. Now that he stopped, fatigue and hunger crept up, and he couldn't help but stifle a few more yawns. Emily Johnson looked at Amelia Martinez's face, still without signs of improvement, though her cheeks remained rosy as if she were merely asleep. Emily Johnson wondered why she hadn't awakened yet. After a while, Emily Johnson felt her arm growing tired and switched hands, going back and forth as both arms grew sore. She couldn't help but marvel at how Charles Blackwood had managed to keep this up all night. Her arms already felt numb and no longer part of her. "Emily Johnson, go get some water to wash Mrs. face." "I'll keep going," Charles Blackwood said after finishing his porridge. Seeing Emily Johnson constantly switching hands to shake the iron device, he figured her arms must be tired. He glanced at the sky outside and added. Emily Johnson nodded, handing the iron device to Charles Blackwood. Watching him take the device and shake it as if it were nothing, she couldn't help but feel both admiration and curiosity. How was he not tired? "What are you standing there for?" Charles Blackwood saw that Emily Johnson hadn't left and was just staring at him. He furrowed his brow slightly. Emily Johnson quickly responded and grabbed a basin, hurrying outside. Her steps were surprisingly quick, as though she were racing to meet someone. As she turned a corner along the corridor, James Smith appeared again. This time, after the few unexpected encounters before, Emily Johnson was no longer frightened. She quickly composed herself, glanced around, and asked, "James Smith DCA, why are you looking for me so early?" "The Crown Prince is waiting for me. Didn't I promise to return it in the morning?" James Smith said, pulling the jade token from his pocket and discreetly handing it to Emily Johnson. She looked around once more before finally feeling safe enough to tuck it back into her own pocket. Inwardly, she felt a flutter of happiness. James Smith hadn't broken his word. He said he'd return it in the morning, and he did, without any delay. "You're done using it, right?" "Yes." James Smith nodded and added, "But next time he needs to leave the palace, I may need to borrow it again." After this experience, Emily Johnson couldn't refuse, so she agreed and said, "All right then, James Smith DCA, I'll go now." James Smith nodded, then as if remembering something, said, "Oh, Emily Johnson, I'll come find you later." Before she could respond, he had disappeared in the blink of an eye. Emily Johnson nodded, thinking to turn back and say, "Okay," but when she did, James Smith was already nowhere to be seen. Thinking about her own little thoughts just now, Emily Johnson couldn't help but blush and, with a slight stomp, muttered, "Really, James Smith DCA just comes and goes." Remembering that the Crown Prince was still waiting for her to fetch water, Emily Johnson looked around once more to confirm James Smith was truly gone before hurrying off to get water. When she returned, Charles Blackwood seemed slightly impatient, and seeing Emily Johnson arriving late with the water, he scolded lightly, "Why are you so slow? Do you always make Miss wait like this?" Emily Johnson lowered her head, walking quietly inside without looking up at Charles Blackwood. She was ready to wash Amelia Martinez's face, not even bothering to wipe the sweat off her own. "Let me do it, you're too clumsy," Charles Blackwood said, seeing Emily Johnson still silent and with sweat on her face. He wasn't sure where she had gone, and though he felt a little annoyed, he didn't say anything more. He took the towel from her hands. Before Emily Johnson could react, the towel was already in Charles Blackwood's hands. She could only lower her head and murmur, "Yes, Your Highness." Then she took the basin and placed it by his feet, waiting quietly by his side. "Go do whatever else you need to do. You don't think I can take care of this myself, do you?" Charles Blackwood glanced at Emily Johnson and noticed that she was staring at him without blinking as he watched Amelia Martinez. For some reason, he felt a bit uncomfortable and gave her a light scolding. Emily Johnson quickly curtsied and left without lingering. Thinking about James Smith saying he would come find her later, Emily Johnson couldn't help but feel a bit anxious, wondering when he might appear. She circled the spot, wondering if James Smith was hiding nearby, ready to jump out and startle her, just like he always did, appearing suddenly and silently by her side. Emily Johnson wandered around in circles, checking a few hidden spots. After confirming that James Smith wasn't hiding anywhere nearby, she finally let out a sigh of relief. But soon after, a wave of self-reproach washed over her. Look at you, searching for him even when he hasn't appeared. So shameless. Seeing that no one was around, she quickly slipped away to one side. Inside, once Emily Johnson had left, Charles Blackwood stood up and leaned over carefully to wipe Amelia Martinez's face. Her skin was as flawless as polished jade, smooth and delicate, with a slight rosy hue that made one irresistibly want to kiss her. Seeing that no one was around, Charles Blackwood finally couldn't hold back. He gently leaned down, placing a soft kiss on Amelia Martinez's forehead, then moved slowly to her red lips. Though it was just a brief touch, he felt satisfied. He then cleared his throat deliberately to cover up his actions before sitting back down, somewhat distractedly, as he continued wiping her arms, which were as smooth as lotus stems. After finishing, Charles Blackwood confirmed that Amelia Martinez still showed no signs of waking. He sighed, remembering the words of the royal physician, her awakening could be quick or slow, depending on her fate. Amelia, your fate is great. You'll surely wake up, Charles Blackwood said, as if speaking to Amelia Martinez, or perhaps to himself. Seeing that she likely wouldn't wake soon, he began to tidy up the basin. At that moment, he caught a glimpse of a figure in the mirror. Although it was only a flash, he recognized it as someone he knew very well, approaching quickly. Charles Blackwood quickly sidestepped and hid behind the wardrobe. It was Ronald Blackwood. Ronald Blackwood found the door slightly ajar and gently pushed it open. Seeing no one inside, he cautiously stepped in, glancing back over his shoulder to confirm he was alone. Approaching Amelia Martinez's bed, he looked at her for a moment before muttering, as if speaking to her, "You can't blame me, blame yourself instead." With that, he brought the porcelain bottle close to her wound. Charles Blackwood, seeing this, quickly emerged and grabbed a wooden comb from the dressing table, throwing it toward Ronald Blackwood. Ronald Blackwood, caught off guard by the unexpected presence in the room, let the bottle slip from his hand, shattering it on the ground. Still stunned, he barely had time to react as Charles Blackwood darted forward, pressing a folded fan against Ronald Blackwood's throat. Seeing that his assailant was none other than Charles Blackwood, Ronald Blackwood clenched his jaw and closed his eyes without a word, as if resigned. "Ronald, so it really is you," Charles Blackwood said, his heart sinking at the sight of Ronald Blackwood. He'd had a bad feeling upon spotting Ronald Blackwood's shadow outside, and now it was confirmed, Ronald Blackwood had entered with the intent to poison. Realizing he had been caught in the act, Ronald Blackwood didn't try to deny it. He met Charles Blackwood's glare, his neck stiffening as he admitted, "Yes, it's me." Charles Blackwood took a small step forward, increasing the pressure of the fan against Ronald Blackwood's throat. Teeth clenched, he spat out the words, "Do you really think I wouldn't dare to do anything to you?" Ronald Blackwood's eyes snapped open, his piercing gaze meeting Charles Blackwood's fierce stare without flinching. He replied, "I know you dare, but before you act, you'd better think it over carefully." Charles Blackwood's heart tightened. He withdrew his fan, turned to the side, and stood slightly turned away from Ronald Blackwood. After a moment, he glanced at Ronald Blackwood and finally said, "You'll need to give me some time." Just then, Emily Johnson, feeling rather bored, pushed the door open and entered. She had wandered around for a while but hadn't seen a single soul, the place was so desolate. She wondered why the king of Ujungwa kingdom had chosen such a remote spot for them to stay. Thinking that Charles Blackwood had probably finished helping Amelia Martinez with her wash, she returned to take the basin, only to open the door and find Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood. Seeing Ronald Blackwood, Emily Johnson felt her heart sink. Recalling the last time she saw Ronald Blackwood here, she clenched her hand tightly, wondering if he was planning something sinister again. Luckily, Charles Blackwood was present, preventing any potential disaster. Emily Johnson greets His Highness the Crown Prince and Prince Ronald, Emily Johnson said, her voice growing softer towards the end. She had always feared the quiet and stoic Ronald Blackwood, and his presence here meant that something was up. She quickly knelt to show respect. "Get up," Charles Blackwood said, his expression softening slightly. He glanced at Amelia Martinez, still lying on the bed, then turned to Emily Johnson and instructed, "I'll be stepping out with the prince for a moment. Keep a close watch on Miss, no one is to enter. If anyone tries to force their way in, you know what to do." Charles Blackwood added after a brief pause, casting a look at Ronald Blackwood before he and Ronald Blackwood exited the room. Emily Johnson quickly nodded. When Charles Blackwood emphasized that last part, she felt a surge of nerves but was relieved that James Smith had returned the jade token to her that morning. If any trouble arose, at least she had a way to handle it. As soon as Charles Blackwood and Ronald Blackwood stepped outside, Emily Johnson was about to close the door in relief when two unexpected figures entered. Her heart skipped a beat, something was wrong. But the two had already entered. Eyes shut tight, she took a deep breath and held up the jade token given by Charles Blackwood, shouting, "How dare you? This is the Crown Prince's token. Who are you to barge in here?" James Smith, watching from the side, stifled a laugh but dared not let it out. Though Emily Johnson seemed timid, her courage was impressive. Fortunately, Henry Blackwood ignored Emily Johnson and simply walked straight to Amelia Martinez's bedside. Realizing that no one had responded, Emily Johnson slowly opened one eye, then the other. She saw that it was James Smith, but before she could speak, he rushed over and covered her mouth with his hand. Emily Johnson stared wide-eyed in shock at James Smith, who raised a finger to his lips, signaling her to be silent. She nodded hurriedly, and only then did James Smith release his hand. Catching her breath, Emily Johnson was about to ask why James Smith was there when she noticed an unfamiliar guard standing by Amelia Martinez's bed, watching her intently. Feeling a sudden surge of anger, Emily Johnson thought, "Who is this man? Miss isn't someone just anyone can come and look at." She was about to scold him. But James Smith quickly grabbed her, motioning for her to stay quiet. Fearing he would cover her mouth again, Emily Johnson hurriedly covered her own mouth, signaling that she understood. She whispered, "Who is that? Is he going to harm Miss?" James Smith awkwardly shook his head. If Emily Johnson recognized Henry Blackwood, he'd have to tell her the truth. Left with little choice, he played along with her misunderstanding to give her time to adjust. "He's a friend of Mississippi. When he heard she was sick, he wanted to come see her." Understanding, Emily Johnson nodded, then asked anxiously, "But what if His Highness the Crown Prince returns? He said not to let anyone in." "Don't worry, they won't be back for a while. If I hear any footsteps, I'll sense it," James Smith whispered with a smile, trying to comfort the anxious Emily Johnson. Emily Johnson nodded, though her heart was pounding like a startled deer. She kept praying silently, hoping this person would leave quickly before the Crown Prince returned. Otherwise, she wouldn't know how to explain it. James Smith noticed Emily Johnson's tension and patted her back gently, saying softly, "Trust me." A blush spread across Emily Johnson's face as she nodded awkwardly. She then looked over at the guard by the bed, guessing this must be the person James Smith had mentioned the previous night. But for some reason, he seemed vaguely familiar. Had she seen him before? Henry Blackwood stood silently, gazing intently at Amelia Martinez, not moving or reaching out to touch her hand, just standing like a statue. Though Emily Johnson couldn't see his expression, she felt an inexplicable fear welling up inside her. Henry Blackwood's intense gaze seemed to want to pierce through Amelia Martinez, or even set her aflame. The figure on the bed remained expressionless, but there was a trace of a serene smile on her face, the same beautiful smile she'd worn at the end. It made Henry Blackwood's heart ache. You sacrificed yourself for him, knowing they wouldn't let you die. Was this your way of forcing me to save him by risking your life? And yet you did it with a smile. Could it be, that you've fallen in love with him? At this thought, Henry Blackwood clenched his fist tightly. He would never allow his woman to love another man. If another man loved his woman, there was only one path for him, death. Henry Blackwood gradually calmed down, even as his dissatisfaction lingered. After all, this was the path he had chosen. Now that Charles Blackwood was on the verge of an alliance with the Ujungwa kingdom, if he couldn't ruin it, then Amelia Martinez would be his final key to securing the throne. Love is often the most potent killer. It doesn't use knives or swords, and it doesn't draw blood, yet it kills people willingly. But he would never allow his woman to love another man. Never. A fiery anger burned in Henry Blackwood's chest, blazing through his eyes as he looked at Amelia Martinez. You said that in this lifetime, you're my woman, and I believe you. I trust that you won't fall for another man. Play along with him for now. Meanwhile, Emily Johnson was chattering away, with James Smith chiming in now and then. Before long, she seemed to forget the unsettling presence in the room and relaxed, laughing and talking with James Smith. With him there, she felt as though she had nothing to fear. James Smith responded lightly, though he felt a storm of mixed emotions inside. If Emily Johnson found out who the guard really was, and that he had deceived her, would she still smile at him like this, with the same carefree joy? He didn't dare to think further. In his mind, he could already envision her furious, storming away, vowing never to speak to him again. Don't you agree? Emily Johnson had been quietly whispering her thoughts about the guard. After a while, when James Smith didn't respond, she turned her gaze back to him and softly called his name a few times. Seeing him lost in thought, she pouted, annoyed, and nudged him. James Smith DCA, what's going on with you? Pulled from his thoughts, James Smith looked at Emily Johnson, her cheeks puffed in frustration. He quickly smiled, though he wasn't sure if it was genuine. Oh, it's nothing. What did you say? Emily Johnson turned away, displeased. She didn't know what was going on with him, but he seemed distracted every time he spoke to her lately. She suddenly wondered if he had something on his mind. Regretting her earlier petulance, she thought, James Smith probably liked well-mannered, intelligent, and graceful women. She couldn't keep acting so childish. She turned back toward James Smith, who was still looking down, lost in thought, and asked gently, Brother James Smith, what's wrong?